obviously, it's a thrill for us to have Secretary of Transportation with us. And Secretary, step in here for a minute. Step in here. I want you to hear what I'm going to say about you. Thank you for accepting our invitation. One of the reasons we wanted you here was because these over 200 people are high-speed rail enthusiasts, and every one of them would like to personally thank you. So on behalf of this group, thank you for getting the $1 trillion bill passed. Thank you to you and President Biden for allocating $3 billion to the Nevada project, $3 billion to the California project, and other money spread around the country. This is a dream that these people have had for years and years and years. And you and President Biden have helped them fulfill and really begin a process that will take our country to the next level of transportation, which is high-speed rail. So you're in good company here, and we are so pleased that you're here. The Secretary's going to say a few words, and then he and I are going to go up on the stage and talk, and there'll be time for questions. Please welcome Secretary Pete Buttigieg.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Secretary. Oh, there you go. Thank you, Secretary, and thanks to all of you for having me. I was going to ask if anything new and exciting happened since the last high-speed rail conference, but I think we all know the answer to that. And it's so thrilling to be here. This year is one we are going to remember in the history of high-speed rail, and also one, though, that I'm very humbled and conscious is building on a lot of groundwork. We talk about some of these larger projects as the cathedrals of our infrastructure, not just because it's a poetic way to talk about something big, but because of how cathedrals are built, which is that the people who lay the cornerstones often know that it will fall to another generation to lay the keystones. And that's certainly been the story of high-speed rail in so many ways. I'm one of those high-speed rail enthusiasts who was thrilled to see the progress made under Secretary LaHood's leadership and during the Obama administration. And I know that we're building on that progress now. So I want to thank all of you. I want to thank Andy Kuntz and everybody with the High-Speed Rail Association. I want to thank many members of Congress who helped us get this done, including a number who have participated today: Senator Padilla, Speaker Emerita Pelosi, Seth Moulton, Rick Larson, Susan Delbene, and Jim Costa. I want to recognize the extraordinary unity that we saw from labor unions involved in building and operating our railways, businesses, including Brightline, environmental groups, state, local leaders, and of course the leadership of President Biden and so many in his administration, including Mitch Landrieu, who helped make all of this possible. I'll be exceedingly brief because I really want to get into our discussion, but I do just want to share a little bit of my enthusiasm about the highlights of this last year and what we have coming. In December, as was noted, we awarded that $3 billion to advance California high-speed rail. Then we awarded another $3 billion in funding, plus bonds to help deliver that high-speed rail between Las Vegas and Southern California, and we are just getting warmed up. It was my honor to help represent the administration breaking ground on that Brightline West project. If it opens by its target date, which is the last year of President Biden's second term, that will be the first high-speed rail in service on American soil. And we're also, of course, proud to be helping to get things on the drawing board that will ultimately lead to compelling construction projects like high-speed rail in Texas, the Pacific Northwest, and so many other places. And then modernizing our existing passenger rail to make sure that it's faster, more reliable, and more convenient. Just yesterday, we opened the next round of applications for funding for projects on the Northeast Corridor, building on the awards that we announced for projects like the Gateway Tunnel, which stands to be the biggest project east of the Mississippi in our lifetime. Proud of that one. So we worked on that. There's the Frederick Douglass Tunnel, and there's so much more. Everyone here knows the benefits of having world-class rail. The faster, safer access to jobs and destinations, the fewer vehicle emissions, the economic opportunity along the line. I am firmly convinced that the first time that the first customer buys that first ticket for that first true high-speed rail on US soil, there will be no going back. People will expect and demand it everywhere. And I believe that leadership on both sides of the aisle will respond. And of course, not just after the lines open, but in the process of building them, we're seeing extraordinary numbers of good paying jobs being created. By the way, happy Infrastructure Week. It is actually Infrastructure Week, and thankfully, it's not a punchline anymore. We are actually backing it with the kind of funding that's making it possible to have a transformative moment in infrastructure. My only other reflection before I take my seat for a discussion is I'm coming at this increasingly now as a parent. Our twins are 2.5 years old. I was on drop-off duty this morning, and they have begun, I have no idea why, but they've begun asking me about my work. I don't know what they think that means, but I try to explain what my job is. And actually I have the benefit, compared to most of my cabinet colleagues, of being able to explain it in terms they'll understand at least a little bit. I tell them I work on cars, that I work on planes, and that I work on trains, and that I'm working on making those trains go faster. And one of the things I really love is the thought that if they're 2.5 now, and if we hit our marks, they will never know a world without high-speed rail in the United States of America. And that's something I'm proud of, and we're just at the outset of building. So thanks again for having me, and I will go take my seat.
So again, thank you so much for being here. And I know all of these people are thrilled to see you, to be able to say thank you. One of the challenges that this organization faced 5 years ago was how to really get the country and the Congress and into a high-speed rail mode of thinking. And because of President Biden's leadership and your leadership, that goal has really been attained. And the $1 trillion bill, the truth is it takes money to do these things. And your encouragement and your help, and the President's help in getting that bill passed, was a bonanza of riches, to say the least. Our next big idea is, and we wonder what you think about this, what do we do about the future funding of high-speed rail? We talked to Congressman Larson about that when he was here, and we've talked to others about it. And we have an idea, but more importantly, we'd like to hear what you all have been thinking about in terms of this money will run out, and have you all been talking and thinking about future funding for high-speed rail?
Thanks. This is part of why we have such a sense of urgency about delivery right now. This is true across the board with the infrastructure package. It's certainly true with high-speed rail. We've got to show what we're doing with these funds in order to earn the credibility to seek more of what it's going to take to get more visions realized. And look, even though on one level it feels like we just got here, the IIJA is a 5-year bill. This is year 3. We are literally smack in the middle of the 5-year life of that bill. So it is far from too soon to be thinking about what we do next. And while some of what we were doing was by design a once-in-a-generation kind of activity, because we were dealing with once-in-a-generation backlogs that hopefully we won't have to do for a long time. That Portal North Bridge, the one we're replacing, this is in the category of just getting regular speed rail, the kind of support that it needs. That thing is a swing bridge that was built in the Teddy Roosevelt administration. The workers had to use sledgehammers to get it to swing back when it's not quite in alignment. The new no moving parts bridge that's going to replace it, that just reached 50% completion, by the way, represents something that I hope and trust will not need to be looked at again for a good 50 to 100 years. On the other hand, when you look at things like rail, taking our rail to the next level, making good on the potential of this, this is not a one and done. It can't be.
right? By definition, networks become more valuable the more there is in them. So even though I believe that the projects that we're funding, the ones we're funding in construction, in Brightline and in California, and the ones that we've identified through Corridor ID that we hope to see evolve toward construction, even though they certainly stand on their own as worthy, viable projects, they are each worth that much more when they're connected into something bigger, right? And so we need to have a network mentality where it's hard to think about filling in missing pieces right now because we're laying the very first pieces. But this is the kind of people who can close, this is a room full of the kind of people who can close your eyes and see not just one point-to-point link, but a national network. And while we're proud of everything we're doing on trains, transit, airports, ports, highways, and bridges, this is the one area, high-speed rail is the one area where we're not talking about refining or updating or saving or modernizing a network. We're talking about creating one. And that is the project of a generation, which means, of course, we're going to need, as a country, to put together the funding to make it happen.
I think what we'd like to do is, as an organization, is take the talent in this room, put together a plan, and before we even talk about dollars, sit with your staff, with Amit and others, and see if that fits with what you all are thinking in terms of long-term funding, because it really is critical. And as you came into the job and as you were thinking about rail and trying to carry out the president's vision, were there rules and regulations? And as a mayor, former mayor, were there rules and regulations that we ought to be thinking about in terms of the ability to really jumpstart high-speed rail in other parts of the country?
In terms of the rules that we have or the ones that we ought to have?
Exactly, yeah, the rules that you face perhaps as a mayor or that these folks have faced. One of the things we talked about was Buy America. Buy America has not stood in the way of companies developing now opportunities to build the rolling stock and the infrastructure right here in America. That's turned out to be a pretty good thing.
Yeah, look, we have found ways, and I know we don't make it easy on ourselves as a country sometimes with some of our permitting processes and other things, even just our grant processes. I mean, just getting our notices of funding opportunity below 100 pages was a big push that I undertook internally, just because I wanted to be able to theoretically read them. And that says nothing of what a grant agreement or an EIS looks like. You all are living this. We're trying to make this more straightforward from the outset. But I think what we're showing with what's happening in high-speed rail is that it can be done, and Buy America is a great example, right? It's hard to think of two things touching transportation the president cares about more than Buy America, making sure that American taxpayer dollars pay for American workers, getting American jobs, making American products, and excellent passenger rail and high-speed rail in the country, which meant, of course, that I could either go in and say, Mr. President, we can do one of these two things you care about, but not both, which was not something that you really, as you know, as a cabinet secretary, want to do unless you have exhausted your creativity to think about how to get through it, or to put together a way that makes sense, that meets both of those goals, which is the approach we're following when it comes to Buy America. Of course, we are very focused on making sure that there develops an American industry. And by the way, one of the most exciting things about this is we're not just creating a network, we're creating an industry. And as a child of the industrial Midwest that rose up around the auto industry, the idea of a U.S. high-speed rail industry taking its place alongside the auto industry is an incredibly compelling vision. We also know that we don't have one right now at scale, and that things have to happen to get from here to there, things that again, people in this room have begun to make possible. And so we need to, more than anything else, I think, recognize that we can get our processes, our systems, our rules, as much as possible, our practice around them has to harmonize with the actual goals of them, which can sometimes be a struggle in building things in the United States. And we need to learn from our international partners, especially international partners in places like Western Europe, who have, and not only, but including Western Europe, who have nothing to prove to us in terms of their commitment to labor, have nothing to prove to us in terms of their commitment to the environment, and yet seem to be able to do things a little more quickly and a little more fluidly than we do, and better understand what that takes and what we need to do to get there.
And in terms of what this group and others can do, how helpful is it to you? And let me just say parenthetically, I think everybody in this room agrees that you have, if not the best, one of the best FRA staffs ever gathered in the history of the department. Amit and his team have done a phenomenal job in so many ways. And so we're grateful that you support them and they support you, and they've supported the efforts of many of these people. How can this group be helpful to Amit, to you, in terms of going forward?
Well, first of all, thanks for the kind word about our FRA team. Obviously, I'm very proud of Amit and the whole team, appointees and career staff who are just doing phenomenal work. One thing I'd like to engage this group to do is to help continue to strip any partisan valence from the work that we're doing around high-speed rail. Obviously, living in our times, we've come to find that anything can get a partisan valence. 5 years ago, I would not have thought that public health or vaccinations could have a partisan valence. Same thing, if you'd asked me 7 years ago, I would have said about electric vehicles. Everything can get partisan. But it doesn't have to be, and it definitely doesn't have to be when it comes to something that everybody benefits from. I would like for us to be able to say, in the same way that we do, famously, there's no Republican potholes or Democratic bridges, to be able to really work to sustain that around the project of high-speed rail. You've led in this in so many ways because of your very bipartisan track record of work. The bipartisan infrastructure law is called bipartisan for a reason. We had a lot of Republicans come across the aisle to work with President Biden, work with Democrats, work with me to get the funding that made this possible. And so one thing that I think is especially important is that I think the various communities and constituencies that this group touches can help do is make it clear that there are so many overlapping valid reasons to be passionate about high-speed rail that we should be able to find nationwide and very bipartisan enthusiasm for it. For those of us who are very focused on climate, the climate rationale is incredibly compelling because no matter how good we get at EVs, there's nothing better than having somebody not have to take a ton of metal with them on the road to go somewhere because there's a great high-speed rail option. For those of us who are very focused on making sure we create good-paying union jobs, again, this idea of building up an industry, creating the rolling stock, as well as the jobs working, operating, and installing and constructing these railroads is incredibly important. But for those who are maybe less attuned to those arguments, I think also there's something about it's the fact that we ought to be best in the U.S. at this. And I don't want to sound nationalist about this, but why should we be resigned to having an inferior standard of service in the United States of America on anything? Least of all, anything that we invented or that we perfected. And if you think back to the tradition that goes back 150 years of the Transcontinental Railroad, rail was what made America America. And so there's something in that I think we can use to appeal to, and you may have seen me doing it on Capitol Hill, to appeal to those who are less moved by the climate or the economic arguments that I think are so important here. So I think this is a very thoughtful group that is organized around the values and virtues of the value and virtues of high-speed rail that can continue telling that bigger picture story that can, and by the way, a lot of the most compelling use cases for high-speed rail are places that are a longish drive or a very short flight away from each other, many of which are in quote-unquote red America. Some of the really cool projects you're working on are in quote-unquote red America. So this doesn't need to be a red and blue thing. I don't think it's become one, but like anything in our country, it's at risk of becoming one if we're not smart about it. So I think that's one area where I think this group can be incredibly, incredibly helpful. Another is just continuing to generate good economic data and arguments, because we continue to be constrained sometimes by this imagination that says that something is only worth building if it is, at a basically if it could be done with its own revenues. But big, large, complex public things, by their very nature, create value that can't be captured by all the people who build them. Now, obviously, as the Brightline effort is demonstrating, we have some really exciting public-private partnerships that I think will show the way forward for many of these projects. But we don't expect driving to pencil out. Driving wouldn't work if we didn't fund a lot of things that go into our roads and highways and cities and our automotive sector. We know that high-speed rail works economically big picture, even if it doesn't work for any one player for it to land on their P&L. So gathering the data that shows that, I think, is going to be really important. And skating to where the puck is going in terms of how the transportation, commuting, and lived experience of Americans is evolving. Post-COVID commuting patterns. Things that maybe are a little bit different in an EV world about driving. Things that are definitely going to be different in an AV world about driving. Things around land use that are shifting in our country. All of those mean that, because we are solving some, like I said, I'm excited to be cutting a ribbon in 2028 on Brightline. But some of the stuff we're building for will ripen in the 2040s. Are we fully accounting for how different the world's going to look in the 2040s and building for that? I think that's something we frankly need the vision of the folks who come to convenings like this to help prod us in the executive branch and the policy world to try to stay on top of. So I'll stop giving you homework there, but those are some of the things that we'd love to see.
Appreciate it. Yeah, very helpful. I'm going to ask you one other question, a little off topic, but I think something that everyone in this room would be interested in, and then we'll take some questions. On the early morning, tell us what it was like to get the phone call about the bridge collapse in the port of Baltimore, and how long, and because you were the face of the administration on this one until President Biden obviously showed up a week or so later. I think these folks would like to know, you and I talked earlier on before you were sworn in about a number of things, and I think I said every day there's a crisis at DOT, probably more than one, when you turn the lights on.
Yep,
anyway,
I remember you mentioning that.
Tell us a little bit about that experience, and also give us some idea, if you have it, how long will it take to get the Baltimore Harbor back to where it should be?
Yeah, look, as you know from your time in leadership at DOT, half of what makes a good day at DOT is the day you build the new thing, you put out the new reg, you proactively launch the thing you were hoping to do. The other half of what makes a good day at the DOT is the train stayed on the rails and the plane stayed in the sky and everything just worked the way it was supposed to. There is a no news is good news quality to the safety half of our job, the safety more than half, the safety imperative that actually defines and justifies the existence of a place like DOT. The last thing I do before I go to bed is I put my cell phone on a dresser across the room so I'm not tempted to stay up all night scrolling. And I put the ringer off silent. I remember getting up, asking myself, did I remember to take it off silent? And luckily I did, because I had left it on vibrate. And I went to bed. And then the phone rang, and then the other phone rang. And you get that call that you're not hoping ever to get, but you'll get from time to time in this job. What was extraordinary is how quickly so many different players across the federal enterprise and up and down different levels of government snapped into action. By the time, I don't remember exactly where it was, probably somewhere between 4 and 5, but by the time I was talking to Wes Moore, the governor of Maryland, he was wide awake and hard at work. Same thing when I was talking to Mayor Scott and engaging the White House. I can't remember the president wanting more details from me across more phone calls in a shorter amount of time than that day. And by the time I was making my way to the site, was making sure that I knew that he wanted the federal government to be there for everything it took down to the penny to help Baltimore and Maryland recover. What I saw there was shocking. a few hours after that phone call when I got there and met the governor and mayor and looked at it. The one thing that doesn't come across in those images we all saw is how big the ship is. It's actually about as long as the span of the fallen span of the bridge itself, which helps to explain why when the ship struck the bridge, it didn't stand a chance. And of course, at the time, we were still hoping that some of those workers who were unaccounted for would survive. Now the remains of all 6 have been recovered. But your mind goes toward what comes next? What can we learn from this from the long term? And we're still engaging NTSB on that. And then what do we do right away? The Army Corps of Engineers and the Coast Guard have done heroic work. Actually, just Monday, you may have seen the remarkable footage of them. They have a term of art for it. I think it's explosive cutting, basically blowing up the little pieces of the bridge that were holding that truss draped over the dolly so that they could clear it out of the channel, and are now in the process of clearing that so that they can clear the channel itself, which means we are increasingly close to those operations at the port getting back to normal. And then there's the matter of the bridge. The new bridge won't look like the old bridge. That bridge went up in the 70s. We know things about how to build a bridge that weren't part of the common practice in the 70s. So the challenge, of course, will be to have the costs and the timeline be under control, knowing that you can't just dust off the old plans from the 70s and use them to put the bridge back up. But again, there's been extraordinary working leadership from Maryland's DOT, Governor Moore, and our interagency partners led by President Biden to see that through. And I'm firmly convinced that Baltimore will come out of this stronger than ever before, even though it's not something you would ever wish on any community, losing the use of the port and then losing a part of their skyline, as they did with the bridge.
Well, as someone who is very accustomed to town meetings, we're glad that you're willing to take a few questions here. Anybody? Please get a microphone to that gentleman there.
That leader. Hello? Can you hear? All right. That leadership you saw around the Baltimore Bridge is the kind of leadership you want to see around rail. That kind of, everyone says, tell me what you want and we'll give it to you right away. Kind of, sorry, is this working? If you have that kind of urgency and leadership around rail that you have around highways when something goes wrong, just like that truck fire in Philadelphia. They needed a certain amount of stuff. Everyone worked together, and it got done in like days, not years. And that kind of leadership is what we want to see in rail as well, and that kind of urgency as well. And if you're able to get everyone to work together, put their differences aside. I've never seen a train identify itself as red or blue. And when I do, I hope it won't be this world. But so,
Do you
anyways,
have a question?
yes. My question is, you talked about standards. Seth Moulton earlier talked a lot about standards, national standards, and it's up to the Department of Transportation to create standards and work with all of its different partners, different people building projects with standards. And so I want to know what the kind of work you're doing to establish those national standards for rail that will, and then in turn make it easier for the industry to all produce the same standard. So everyone's making the same standard parts, same standard trains, and they can have interoperability in the future when different lines are being expanded.
Thanks. Yeah, this is a classic challenge, right, for us in the policymaking space, which is we want to make sure that we're providing a very clear framework for predictability for industry and, most importantly of all, for safety. And at the same time, not be so prescriptive that we're taking on as government what is best done by parties that are outside of government. And so we need to establish a framework with enough room there. That's what the FRA's processes around proving out the safety, first on paper, first in the modeling, and then in the physical testing are really about. But here, again, I think we have a real advantage in being able to engage, and frankly, engage with a little bit of humility with the rest of the world. We were in Japan last year for the G7. They were hosting the G7 transport ministerials. And our ministerials in a smaller community, so we took that Shinkansen train to go to the community from Tokyo where it was being held. And just sitting on that train is an extraordinary experience. Sitting in the operator cab of that train, which they let me do, one of those fun things you get to do as secretary, was a spiritual experience. But the really striking thing is they've been doing this since the 60s. They've been refining it, but they've been doing it since the 60s. So I mentioned Japan because that's famously a pioneering example, but we could point to so many places in the country, including ones that are working on more novel strategies or technologies. And again, not only in East Asia or Western Europe. And make sure that what we're doing is in that context. We will set the right American standard that makes sense for American policy. But this is different from advanced air mobility, for example, where the FAA is figuring out how to regulate something that we literally don't have a framework to do because we know how to do airplanes and we know how to do helicopters. And now we've got these eVTOLs that are both. And you can either make them fit both sets of regulations, which doesn't quite make sense, or come up with a new way of thinking about this, which is what they're doing, right? This is actually not that. It's not novel in the same way. So we can stand on the shoulders of giants here a little more while crafting it in a way that makes sense for us. And again, the real art of it will be to be predictable enough that industry can pick it up and run with it, and that it's ironclad in terms of its safety, but flexible enough that we're not prescribing every little decision that really should be the sorts of things that firms compete over as they're trying to make the absolute best trains.
Yes, in the back there. Yeah,
Yes.
go ahead, please.
Hi, it's Kristen Seymour. Great to see you, Mayor Pete, or sorry, Secretary Pete.
I will always happily answer to Mayor Pete.
I'm sorry, Secretary Pete, yes. I'm with Aegis Group, and I have a question for you. I think it's important as we move forward that we also look back, and you talked about America being America of first. We were the first country to put a man on the moon, to step foot on the moon. What's taken us so long, do you think, to really embrace this technology? Because we're just lagging so far behind our fellow countries. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, part of us, you get what you pay for, right? We just never had this moment in terms of the funding we have on our, not in my lifetime anyway, not since Amtrak was created 50 years ago, has there been this much funding for passenger rail of any kind, including high-speed rail. But part of it, and again, I'm sitting with Secretary Hood, who marshaled considerable funding to advance the ball here, but part of it was politics, right? And we really need to, I think, strip that away because we've seen that everybody's better off when we're good at this. But in terms of national pride, we should aspire to be the best at this, just like we aspire to be the best at everything else. Especially because this technology actually meets the needs of the times, even more than anybody was thinking about when they were putting up the first high-speed rail in the 60s, because they weren't really thinking about climate the way we do. So it's a rare example of a technology that so many technologies face obsolescence, or their relevance is gradually attenuated by developments around the world. This is the rare technology that has actually found that its relevance has increased based on developments around the world. Again, advances in how we think about land use, and certainly advances in how we think about climate. So if there was ever a time for us to assert a leadership role on something, it's now. And that's exactly what we're trying to do under President Biden's leadership here.
Ezra?
Hi, Mr. Secretary. What do you think about the idea of creating a rail trust fund to help move high-speed and intercity rail forward around the country?
I should probably check with my boss before I make an official administration statement about this. But what I'll say is that we do need to think about the sustainability of rail funding. Look, this is actually doing better than some parts of our transportation funding. I would point toward aviation, where the FAA actually has to rely on year-by-year appropriations to capitalize multi-billion-dollar IT investments. Think about how hard it is to do any multi-billion-dollar IT project. Then think about how it's even harder to do that in the public sector. And then imagine having to do that without knowing from one year to the next what your capital picture looks like. That's what the FAA has been contending with. And I would argue, given those constraints, doing heroic work. But it's why the president's budget request for next year actually has a mandatory account that helps us stand up the $8 billion that'll be needed so you can plan it out in a more rationalized way. So at least we got a 5-year advance appropriation on the rail work that we're doing. But when you think about what we can count on with the trust fund that we do have for aviation, or certainly the highway trust fund, not that isn't getting complicated on its own merits, because the gas tax obviously isn't how we're going to be funding highways in the 2050s, or by the end of this decade, really facing some changes there. But we certainly need to look at how to have a more steady, stable, and predictable basis for funding these things. Although again, in my opinion, The moment we actually have a real live butt-in seat experience on high-speed rail in the US, it's no longer people coming back from Japan saying, why can't we have nice things? It's people coming back from Vegas saying, why can't I have this in Cincinnati, right? And I do think that will increase the appetite, not just for big picture long-term work, but for that year-to-year funding to be there.
Andy? Grab a mic, Andy.
Once we get that first one up and running, we're 100% in agreement with you. It's going to take off like crazy. That's the question we want to know is, at that point, how fast can we scale this up? How fast can we get FRA moving? How fast can we get the funding? And, I mean, I know you don't control all of it, but we'd like to really be prepared so we can really step on the gas and just start mass producing these.
Yeah, look, I believe in a snowball effect here. And the pioneering work that has been done patiently or maybe impatiently, but over a long period of time by folks here has set us up, I think, to start to see that curve take off. Look at what California high-speed rail is doing, right? Including, paying that pioneer premium for being the first in the country to set out to do this and encountering all these issues that were never encountered before by an American high-speed rail project going into construction, because there never was an American high-speed rail project going into construction, right? And so between what California is doing and what Brightline is doing, it sets you up for being that much quicker at the next effort. One of the reads I would recommend to anyone who's interested in doing big things that I found very instructive is a book about mega projects. It's written by it turns out there's a whole academic discipline about how mega projects work, going back to the pyramids, and why they going back to the pyramids have almost always gone over budget and taken too long. I think it's called How Big Things Get Done, but it talks about the importance of just having a reference class of cases that you can point to, and a body of people who have done something like this before. In your country or in your jurisdiction. Building that can lead to huge breakthroughs, which we're going to need to, because many of the places that are most compelling for high-speed rail don't have, for example, the elegant right-of-way solution of just shooting the train down the median of I-15 in the desert. That is part of why Brightline was able to put together the proposal they did. But I think that we should expect. Expect is too, I don't want to be naive about this. I think we should aspire toward and then realize a level of growth that is not linear, but more and more exponential until we get that network effect. Because again, the more the network starts to fill out, the more you get the actual benefits of this fully realized. And those aren't just benefits for travelers. They're benefits, even if you don't use it, you benefit from the people who do, because they're not competing with you for the congested highway, right? Those benefits cascade, they snowball. And I think the construction will too, provided we get this moment right, which is why so much depends on us in this deciding decade to take the resources, the hard-won resources that were entrusted to us through this bipartisan infrastructure package, and turn them into results that nobody can argue with. I want someday somebody to come back from the United States to one of these advanced countries and say, man, why can't we have what they're doing in the US? I know we're not there yet on rail, but we will be.
That is a fabulous aspiration. Last question. Great aspiration. Can you pass the mic over here, please? Last question.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you. My question is going to be very quick. The infrastructure of the existing rails that we have right now that you can be transformed to high-speed trains, high-speed rails, and it's owned, most likely it's owned by certain privatized railroads. So FRA can actually put their foot down and say, you give up certain rails that we can dedicate to. Is any kind of regulations that's built to prefer certain railroads for that particular high-speed projects?
So mostly this has been discussed in the realm of conventional speed projects, but I do think ultimately we need to look at its implications for high speed too. Obviously a different story, because a lot of what's been achieved on the world's best, safest high-speed rails has been dedicated lines. But one thing I would note that I think a lot of Americans who occasionally ride Amtrak intercity would be surprised by is the fact that the delays they experience are typically about the host railroad. One thing I was surprised by when I got here was discovering that the host railroad has always had a legal responsibility to let the passenger trains go first. It just hadn't been enforced very fully. The IIJA gave us more teeth, and the Surface Transportation Board is rightly being more muscular in its enforcement. And we have already seen dramatic differences. We're not where I want us to be, but we've seen real, we got their attention and saw some real changes and improvements in the on-time performance because of the better than before compliance of the Class 1 freight railroads. I'm very mindful of the importance of using our status as being among the few people who can get calls returned by the Class 1 railroads to benefit not just American supply chains, but American passenger rail. And we will continue to use that in partnership with the STB, which I think it has a very important role to play here. Was that diplomatic enough? Yeah.
One last fun question. Other than having $1 trillion to spend, what is the best part of your job?
That is a fun one. At first I would have thought it would be the kind of moments where you just live out, if you're a transportation geek anyway, these kind of boyhood fantasies about transportation. I'm sure you had some moments you might remember. I had the chance to literally kick the tires of a 747. I was lowered in this cage-like object into the tunnel that they're still blasting in Atlanta under the airport to build the new leg of the rail there. Sitting in the jump seat of an aircraft making an approach to Juneau, Alaska, and seeing how that works. I would have thought that would be the best part, and it is pretty good. But honestly, the best part of these moments where we've been cooking something for a long time and then it gets there. Including some of the rulemakings that we're doing. And I never thought I'd be this jazzed about rulemakings, even for a policy geek. But some of the stuff that we've been working on that's going to benefit safety, the minimum crew size rule that's going to, I'm convinced, save lives on America's freight railroads. The airline refund rule, which is a frequent flyer as well as a policymaker, I'm pretty excited about. Making sure that you can get your money back without fighting for it when an airline owes you money. And then going to these places that didn't think they would hear from us in the federal government and delivering something for them. Obviously, I'm very excited about Brightline. Very excited about the Hudson Tunnel project. We're $11 billion into that. But honestly, some of the most rewarding moments have been six-figure grants. We did one in Chamberlain, South Dakota. This is a community of 2,500 people, but they're actually big enough to have an airport. And that airport actually really matters. Not just for the pheasant hunting, that's an important part of their local economy, but for crop dusting and, most importantly of all, air ambulance in a community that's 2 or 3 hour drive to the nearest level 1 trauma center. And they're big enough to have an airport, but their general aviation terminal is basically a dressed up double wide. If you look closely, it's a mobile home pretty much. With a 6-figure grant, we're getting them the funds to have an actual building. A brick and mortar building that's going to make a difference for the pilots and the passengers and the patients. Tell City, Indiana, the other end of the state from where I grew up, that's got a port. And the Port Authority, consists of volunteers, largely retirees. They conduct their business over coffee at the diner in town, but they operate this port, which basically consists of a floating crane. Which is not the first thing you think of when you think ports, but it's not the Port of Long Beach and the tens of thousands of containers coming through there every hour. But it's everything to this community because the barges come down the Ohio River carrying pig iron that gets taken offloaded there and then goes up the hill to a foundry that accounts for 1,000 jobs in a community of 7,000 people. And if the river's too high, or if the river's too low, which is happening more and more these days, they have a problem. So with about $1.5 million out of the same program that we're using to do 10,000 feet of on-dock rail in Long Beach for millions, we're getting them a crane that's on land instead of on a barge. And those kinds of things, you go to these towns that just didn't think anyone cared about them. And of course, it's not that nobody cared about them, it's that the funding wasn't there before. And to actually be able to celebrate those solutions coming to them on projects that we didn't think up. We don't think up any projects. We're at 56,000 projects so far under IIJA. Not one of them was invented at the DOT headquarters in Navy Yard. All of them came from some community somewhere. that came to us saying, we would build this if we had the funding. Can you fund it? And now, more than ever before, we get to say yes. That's the best part of the job.
Well, thank you for thank you for saying yes to President Biden. Thank you for saying yes to our invitation here. You, as I said earlier, are helping every one of these people live out their dream of taking high-speed rail and rail to the next level of generation for transportation for the next generation, for your two beautiful children. We're grateful for your public service, and we're grateful for your vision for what all these people have been dreaming about for years. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Roger.
Good to see you. Thank you.